Hello, Music 12 students. We're going to start with the Chapter 10 lecture, which goes along with the same textbook, Resonances. This time we're looking at Chapter 10, Support and Protest. This again goes along with Unit 4 now, which is Musical for Political Expression. So we're going to see now how does music play a role in support of politics, but also how does it sometimes protest against politics of the time. So let's go ahead and take a look at this chapter. In the previous chapter, we examined various ways in which nations can be represented by musical means. Our examples included national anthems, pieces of art music that draw from folk sources, and a complete musical tradition with national significance. In this chapter, we will turn our attention to the role of music in political action, and we'll see how music can not only represent a nation, but also directly influence its character and future. As we already discussed in the context of national anthems, music can bring people together and inspire them to feel sympathetic toward one another. Music, especially participatory music, can create community. Music can also inspire an emotional response in the listener. These capacities are combined to great effect when music is used to urge a group of people to think or act along specific political lines. Sometimes, music is employed in support of a political candidate or ideology. The most prominent examples include campaign songs, music played at political rallies, and the soundtracks to political advertisements. In all of these cases, music is used to inspire sympathy with a cause or candidate and win the support of the listener. However, the creators of the music in question do not always have a say in its political use. More often than not, music is co-opted for political purposes and used in ways that the original artist had never imagined and may not approve of. In such cases, we see the capacity of music to express meaning beyond its creator's intent. Other times, music is used to combat a dominant political force. The first prominent example of this is the protest song, in which it is used to inspire resistance to an ongoing political action. When music is used to protest ruling powers, however, there's always an element of danger. Those who position themselves in opposition to governments or bosses risk serious reprisal. For this reason, protest music is not always easy to decipher. Sometimes it is overt in its meaning, meaning clearly indicating the objectionable situation and the desired action. Sometimes, however, it is covert, instead disguising its meaning so that only certain listeners will receive the message. In such cases, it can be difficult to determine exactly what pieces can be identified as overt and covert examples within this chapter. So now we're going to look at music as political advocacy, so music that is meant to support a candidate or sometimes maybe not meant to support it, but like they said on the previous slide, that idea of co-opting, that sometimes people will reuse other people's music for causes or for reasons that the original artist may not agree with. So this is an essential part of this chapter and very important to consider. The use of music to rally support for a political cause has a long history. Music has been used around the world to display the power of monarchies, to urge soldiers into battle, and to inspire patriotic support for all manner of governments. Here, we will focus on the role of music in American politics, with special attention given to specific songs that have been used by candidates seeking election to the presidency. Although we are focusing on campaign songs, those are not the only musical tools that have been employed by American political candidates. Before the rise of mass media, campaigning was conducted in person at events such as rallies, parades, and whistle stops, often to the accompaniment of a local brass band playing popular and patriotic tunes. Today, we are more likely to hear campaign music via television, whether we are watching a televised campaign event or a paid political advertisement. At events, candidates are likely to use popular songs that convey a relevant message, set the right mood, or speak to a desired voting base. In advertisements, we are likely to hear underscoring, similar to that used in television shows and movies. Such music attracts less attention than a popular song, but it plays an equally important role in communicating the candidate's message. So again, underscoring is music that is meant to just be the backdrop of a video, but we'll see in a couple of the examples that the music that we use really can change the tone of how a message is received. To see underscoring at work, we might examine two recent television advertisements from a 2016 Republican candidate for governor of Georgia, Casey Cagle. In a spot from early in the campaign, titled Difference, Casey touts his humble beginnings, strong personal ethic, and political accomplishments. The music behind his voiceover is bouncy and cheerful. The major mode tells us that this is a message of optimism, while the mid-tempo drum beat and repetitive staccato melody notes are reassuring and uplifting. Later in the campaign, however, Cagle, in response to a strong showing by his rival, attempted to construct a new public persona for himself, one that empathized strength and determination. These qualities are reflected in the television advertisement About, which features music that would be equally at home in an action film. The minor mode and suspenseful harmonies keep the listener on edge, while periodic percussive strikes suggest danger and unrest. As musicologist Naomi Graber has observed, the music builds to a climax in parallel with Cagle's rousing speech, suggesting that Cagle himself is the superhero in this narrative. So the two videos that they're talking about are right here. Again, this one shows a much more upbeat, positive, and cheerful message, and the music that we hear behind it, like they say, major mode, mid-tempo drum beat, repetitive staccato melody notes, all this makes it sound reassuring and uplifting. Whereas this one takes a harsher approach, trying to show power, and in that case they use the minor mode and suspenseful harmonies, which also gives the illusion that there is a danger that needs to be fought, right? So again, none of this is really stated exactly, but the music helps bring this point really forward and home. So pause. These are very short political advertisements, so not trying to put politics on anybody, but these are just two good examples of how the music is really an important aspect of these campaign ads. Candidates are sometimes musicians themselves, and are therefore able to exploit their own musical skills to win the sympathy and support of the public. In 1886, for example, two brothers, Alf and Bob Taylor, ran against one another in a bid to become governor of Tennessee. Both men were excellent fiddlers, and they not only performed frequently throughout the campaign, but also used their love of folk music to establish a down-home identity and connect with rural voters. More than a century later, President Bill Clinton advertised himself as a fun-loving and cool guy by playing saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, while Democratic presidential candidate Martin O'Malley garnered attention by playing guitar and singing Taylor Swift's Bad Blood on The View. Although the genres and skill levels of these candidate performances varied widely, all used music to paint themselves as good-humored and relatable. So here we see the three examples. One, the Alf and Bob Taylor, the brothers, who actually use the fiddle as a way to um, almost signify the battle for this governor position in Tennessee. Bill Clinton on the Arsenio Hall show playing the saxophone, and Martin O'Malley singing and playing the guitar in 2014. All were designed to just make the candidates more interesting, more relatable. When it comes to conveying a specific political message through music, song is clearly the best choice, and it has been used since the beginning of American electoral politics. In the earliest years, election songs were usually parodies. As early as George Washington's re-election campaign in 1792, supporters advocated their candidates' causes by writing new words to recent popular songs. This technique could be very effective. Because the melody was already familiar, parody lyrics were quickly learned, sung, and spread. The success of a popular song could even contribute to the success of the campaign that chose to parody that song. In 1840, William Harrison's campaign song Tippecanoe and Tyler Too, which parodied the familiar song The Three Little Pigs, became so popular that it was widely credited with winning him the presidency. There's also a long history of presidential candidates relying on endorsements by celebrity musicians to boost their popularity. The earliest example of this came in 1860, when famous abolitionist singer Jesse Hutchinson wrote a parody song in support of Abraham Lincoln. The song, Lincoln and Liberty Too, set to the tune of Rosin the Bow, was a hit. The Hutchinsons' popularity probably contributed just as much to Lincoln's victory. Okay, so this relates already to question number 2. We've kind of glossed over question 1 already, talking about what role does music play in political rule and campaigning. You can go back for that. But here in slide 6, talking about why were parody songs used. This gives a really excellent example of why parody songs were favored. Because they were easy to learn, people already knew the melodies. It was easy to get new lyrics out to the public and spread these songs quickly to people. Remember, there was no social media, there was no television or radio during these early elections, so it was an easy way to get your message out to people using music as a hook to get these ideas and support of the candidates across. So that's a little bit there on question number 6. And we see the same thing, this use of parodying songs or reusing popular melodies, even with the Star Spangled Banner that we learned about in the previous chapter, that it was actually set to another drinking song, the Anacreontic Hymn, which later becomes the same melody that is used for the Star Spangled Banner. So all kind of related to this time period. Now we're jumping into question number 3 on slides 7 and 8 here, about new forms of media and recording and how it affects campaign songs and connecting to the American people, specifically in the 1920s and 30s. New songs have always also been written in support of presidential candidates, so new songs as well. While this practice dates to the early 20th century, it is particularly widespread today when anyone can write a song, record a performance, and upload their contribution to social media. Technology has always influenced the role of music in presidential elections. Beginning in the 1930s, the prevalence of radio and later television led campaigns to employ songs that were already popular, an approach that proved more effective than the creation of a new song that might or might not have proven a hit. In this chapter, we will consider 3 such songs. These songs are all quite different in style and message, but they share one important thing in common. None of them were written with any political end in mind. In each case, the presidential campaign co-opted the song because it supported the campaign's political message. So again, that co-opting, political campaigns using songs from artists and kind of attaching them to their campaign. We see this across politics. So already we're seeing that radio and later TV play this big role in getting these songs out to the public. Here's more about the 1920s and 30s, and we have one of our first listening examples of the chapter. So we're going to look at Milton Ager and Jack Yellen, their song called Happy Days Are Here Again, and how this relates to a specific presidential campaign. The first presidential candidate to co-opt a popular song for his campaign was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in 1932 adopted the recent hit song Happy Days Are Here Again to represent his political agenda. Although the song was not created for his campaign and did not communicate an explicitly political message, Roosevelt found that it perfectly captured the spirit of his presidential bid. It is no surprise that Roosevelt should have been the first presidential candidate to use a popular song in his campaign. The 1920s and 1930s were a time of extraordinary growth in the music recording and broadcast industries, with the result that popular music songs were more influential than ever before. The first commercial license was issued to a radio station in 1921, while 1925 saw the invention of the electrical microphone and an accompanying improvement in the quality of recorded and broadcast sound. Due in part to the economic downturn of 1929, radio soon eclipsed the phonograph in popularity. The most successful programming in that era consisted of live musical performances. Roosevelt was the first presidential candidate, and later president, to take full advantage of the radio as a platform for connecting with Americans and spreading his message. So this really relates to question 3 here on slide 8, talking about how does the technology that we have influence our culture. Imagine this, for the first time, songs could be broadcast on radios across the country. Before, music was possibly more regional. You would have to be in the South to hear Southern music. You'd have to be on the West Coast to hear West Coast music. But now, for the very first time, songs can be popular on a nationwide level because of things like the radio, but also improvements in recording quality with new microphone technology. that really made the recordings better quality as well. So things caught on better because they were more interesting. And last, even Roosevelt was a candidate who would take full advantage of the radio in connecting with Americans. He had something that were called the fireside chats, in which he chatted with Americans through the radio. I think it was once a week or once a month, just talking to them almost like a presidential address through the radio. So, before you move on, make sure that you watch this video right here. Again, Happy Days Are Here Again, this time sung by Annette Shaw. Continuing here. The decision to play Happy Days Are Here Again at the 1932 Democratic National Convention was made spontaneously after the man who introduced Roosevelt gave a lifeless and dour speech. So he gave a boring speech, someone else, in introducing him. Roosevelt's campaign managers had originally intended to brand him with "Anchors Aweigh," a nod to his Navy service. But they felt that the occasion called for something more lively and selected Happy Days Are Here Again at the last moment. The song proved effective and was used for the remainder of the campaign. In fact, it was such a success that Happy Days Are Here Again was associated with the Democratic Party for many years to come. In 1932, a song like Happy Days Are Here Again would have had particular resonance with Americans who were experiencing the worst effects of the Great Depression. The 1930s saw a public clamor for escapist films, theater, and songs. Almost no popular songs from this era reference the difficulties that plagued Americans following the stock market crash of October 1929. Instead, they celebrate good times, affluence, and carefree living. So this is, again, question number 4. We're moving right along here. How did the song Happy Days Are Here Again appeal to listeners at the time of its release? Why was this song an appropriate selection for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential campaign? So he was running during the Great Depression for the presidency. So for this song, we see kind of the main idea here is escapist films, theater, and songs. Think of it this way: when you're having maybe some really awful feelings, you're going to have probably more of a chance of hearing happy music to cheer you up. So the same thing was true. During the Great Depression, people were gripping with economic challenges. The stock market crash meant that many people were left in poverty across the country. So when you turn on the radio to hear some music, are you going to want to hear something happy or something sad that reminds you of the reality of the hard times that the people were living in, right? Exactly that. People are going to go for the happy song because it's a way of escaping the reality that they were facing. So this song, Happy Days Are Here Again, is a great example of an escapist song. The authors of Happy Days Are Here Again, composer Milton Ager and lyricist Jack Yellen, were themselves the beneficiaries of fortunate timing, for they wrote their song just before the onset of the Great Depression. Happy Days was commissioned by MGM for inclusion in an early sound film, Chasing Rainbows. While waiting for the film to be released, however, Ager and Yellen provided their song to bandleader George Olson, who performed regularly at Hotel Pennsylvania in New York City. Olson's band premiered Happy Days on October 24, 1929, the day of the stock market crash. Olson supposedly called on his soloists to sing it for the corpses, a reference to the morose diners who had just lost their life savings. As Yellen recalled, after a couple of choruses, the corpses joined in, sardonically, hysterically. Before the night was over, the hotel lobby resounded with what had become the theme song of ruined stock spectaculars as they leaped from hotel windows. That's a bit exaggerated, I think. Happy Days Are Here Again went on to become a major hit. It appealed to listeners who reveled in the irony of the lyrics. Happy Days were certainly not anywhere to be seen, but it also embodied the American spirit of optimism and perseverance in the face of extreme difficulty. Their lyrics, like most of those successful songs, are not about any particular event or situation. Instead, they speak in broad terms, bidding farewell to sad times and bad times, before celebrating the fact that the skies above are clear again, and calling on all to tell the world that happy days are here again. So the idea here, again, a bit of escapism, but you can also say a spirit of optimism in the song. You can almost say that it was ironic to be appreciative of this song, given what it says in what was happening at the time. Happy Days Are Here Again was a project of songwriting industry known as Tin Pan Alley. The main product of Tin Pan Alley was song publishers with sheet music, which consumers would purchase so that as to be able to perform hit songs in their own homes. By 1929, sheet music sales had already been eclipsed by phonograph sales, and radio was further eating into the popular music market share. Still, songwriting teams, usually in the employment of Tin Pan Alley publishers, continued to crank out potential hits in the 1940s. The name Tin Pan Alley refers to the discordant sounds of cheap pianos being played in the many publishing houses located on a single block in Manhattan. So that's where they get the name Tin Pan Alley. The pianos that were played in these environments were usually played a lot and were probably not maintained very well. They were really workhorse pianos, you could say. During the Tin Pan Alley era, songs were not often associated with individual performers. Instead, hit songs were recorded by all of the prominent singers, each of whom was expected to perform a common repertoire. Happy Days Are Here Again was first recorded in November 1929 by Leo Reisman and his orchestra, but this was only the first in a parade of renditions by a variety of popular singers. We will consider the 1930 recording by Ben Sylvan and his orchestra with Annette Hanshaw on vocals. Ben Sylvan holds the honor as the most productive recording artist in American history, having recorded as many as 20,000 individual tunes. It is difficult to make an exact count because Sylvan recorded under dozens of different names for all of the major record labels of his era. This was a typical practice, since performing artists were required to sign exclusive contracts with recording companies. The use of pseudonyms, or fake names, allowed an artist to triple or quadruple their income by recording with a variety of labels. As a producer at Columbia Records, Selvin, who also oversaw the creation of recordings by other artists. His catalog includes some of the finest records made in the early 1930s. Annette Hanshaw was among the countless singers who performed and recorded with Selvin's band. She was also very famous in her own right, being voted the best female popular singer in a 1934 Radio Stars magazine poll. Hanshaw, however, later confessed that she detested performing and could not stand her own records. She loved music, but became very nervous in front of a microphone, and was dissatisfied with her abilities as a singer. Selvin and Hanshaw's recording of Happy Days Are Here Again is typical of 1920s era sweet jazz. This type of music was intended primarily for dancing, and it could be heard in upscale urban hotels, ballrooms, and on the radio. Selvin's band contains instruments that we associate with jazz today, such as saxophones, trumpets, trombones, and piano. But in keeping with the standard of the era, it also contains a violin section, and the bass line is played on the tuba instead of a string bass. The tempo is lively, and the beat is clearly articulated by the rhythm section, which is piano and tuba. Ager and Yellen's jazz-influenced tune is highly syncopated, meaning that melody notes often fall between the beats. So remember, syncopated has to do with syncopated rhythm, that the rhythms are falling off of the beats quite often. We can hear this in the chorus. The word happy falls on the beat, but the words days and are come after the beat. Try clapping the pulse while reciting the lyrics in rhythm to see how this works. This pattern is repeated with the next phrase, in which here falls on the beat, but the second syllable of again comes off the beat. Selvin's band makes this pattern sound even more exciting by shortening the melody notes that fall on the beat. So when you listen to the recording, you can try to clap along with this and see where the beat is, but just to show it, it's almost like happy days are here again. So some of those are on the beat, some are off the beat. It again plays into that syncopated rhythm. And here we see band leader Ben Selvin, who recorded 20,000 tunes and some under other different names, pseudonyms. The form of this recording is also typical of the era. Although the song Happy Days Are Here Again technically begins with a verse, Selvin chooses to open his rendition with a much catchier chorus. After singing through the chorus once, Hanshaw sings the verse, which is much shorter than the chorus and also in the minor mode. This provides a welcome contrast, but the change in mood doesn't last long. Next, we hear a rendition of the chorus by an anonymous trio of male singers. Finally, we get an instrumental version, with the male singers joining in for the closing phrase. In short, most of the recording is taken up by 3 complete turns through the chorus, which by the end of the 3 minutes is firmly lodged in the listener's head. So again, very repetitive music. Helps it be catchy and helps get the message out too. So it was a good choice for a political campaign. This approach to the production of popular music, extreme repetition, softened by a brief excursion into contrasting material, is still with us today. Although the form, sounds, and lyrics have all changed, record producers continue to foreground the most memorable musical material while finding opportunities to introduce contrast. This delicate balance between too much repetition, which would make a song annoying, and too little, which would prevent it from being memorable, characterizes the eternal formula for successful popular music. So again, we talked about this in the very first chapter about repetition versus not enough repetition or variation. You have to find that sweet balance to make it memorable, but not annoying because you're hearing the same thing too many times. Okay, so we're moving into question 5 with another example from a different era. In this case, it's Bridge Over Troubled Water. Successful campaign songs always combine a relevant text with music that sets an appropriate emotional tone. It is easy to see how a song like Happy Days Are Here Again could serve this purpose well. It is bright and cheerful and exhibits unchecked optimism about the future. So that's the previous selection. Happy Days Are Here Again. Makes sense. It's bright, it's cheerful, it makes you excited about the candidate. The 1970s Simon and Garfunkel hit, Bridge Over Troubled Water, is a less obvious choice for a political campaign. While the song's lyrics touch on themes that a candidate might want to emphasize, the music lacks the energy of a typical campaign song. We will begin, therefore, by examining the song itself. Then we will consider why George McGovern, the Democratic challenger to President Richard Nixon, might have selected it for his 1972 campaign. In 1969, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel were 2 of the biggest stars in American popular music. The recent albums Sound of Silence and Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme had both proved major hits, and they were at the forefront of the folk rock genre. Although both men sang and made contributions to the duo's arrangements, Simon was the lead songwriter, a fact that caused some friction, as Simon increasingly felt that Garfunkel was not making an equal contribution to the partnership. The duo broke up in 1970, just as their 4th album, Bridge Over Troubled Water, was rapidly climbing the charts. Simon wrote Bridge Over Troubled Water very quickly in 1969. He later recounted that the basic idea took him about 20 minutes to work out, while the whole song was finished in under 2 hours. The title lyric was inspired by a line from the 1958 Swan Silvertone song, Mary Don't You Weep, in which Claude Jeter sings, I'll be your bridge over deep water if you trust in me. Simon's source ended up shaping not only the lyrics but the sound of his new song. The Swan Silvertones were an African American gospel group, and their music drew from the rich tradition of black church music. Although Simon and Garfunkel did not attempt a wholesale imitation of the style, they wanted the recording to reflect the influence of gospel, a style discussed in Chapter 11, so next week we'll see that. Bridge Over Troubled Water contains 3 verses, the last of which was added at the request of Garfunkel to support the song's dramatic musical climax. Simon wrote the verse, but never cared for it. His message was communicated in its entirety in the first 2 verses. These vow to the listener that, although they may be weary, feeling small, down and out, or on the street, the singer will always take your part and lay me down, like a bridge over troubled water. In short, the song promises solace and support for anyone who is experiencing difficulties in life. And here we see the duo Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, one of the greatest folk or rock duos in history. Although Simon wrote the song using his favorite instrument, the guitar, he chose to make the recording with a piano played in the gospel style. The instrumental introduction, which is with its grandiose chords and syncopated rhythms, could indeed preface the entrance of a gospel singer. Instead, we hear the voice of Garfunkel, which Simon thought was better suited to the tune than his own. The first verse is accompanied only by piano. The second verse is additionally supported by vibraphone, which adds warmth and resonance without changing the character of the song. So the vibraphone is almost like a metal xylophone. It has a sustain pedal, just like a piano does, that allows the metal bars of the instrument to ring and has a really beautiful sound, one of my favorite instruments. At the conclusion of the second verse, however, the music takes a new direction. First, a drum set crashes onto the soundscape. Strings enter next, followed by an electric bass. The full instrumental forces grow in energy throughout the third and final verse, which also features Simon singing a harmony part. In the final seconds of the song, the tempo slows as the strings ascend to their highest note, producing a triumphant conclusion. Despite the drama that Simon and Garfunkel were able to produce in their studio recording of Bridge Over Troubled Water, the song itself is not particularly energetic. It features a slow tempo, a sustained vocal line, and lyrics that encourage the listener to feel calm and resolute. It's not a song one would play to rile up a crowd or to energize enthusiastic support for a cause. All the same, George McGovern chose Bridge Over Troubled Water as the theme song for his 1972 presidential bid, and he played it at his rallies throughout the campaign. The song certainly embodied many of McGovern's values. He ran on a platform of national unification and healing, advertising his ability to reach across the aisle and bring opposing factions together. The preceding years had indeed been characterized by devastating internal conflict, including the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the 1969 Stonewall riots, and growing unrest concerning the war in Vietnam. Unrest that culminated in the 1970 Kent State Massacre, in which National Guardsmen killed 4 student protesters. McGovern positioned himself as staunchly anti-war candidate who would bring peace to the nation. For this reason, Bridge Over Troubled Water was uniquely suited to his campaign. At one point, McGovern even quoted the song directly, stating, "I want, indeed, to become a bridge over troubled waters." So we saw a lot of these themes or major events in American history in the late 1960s and early 70s. Also in the chapter talking about Woodstock Festival, that many people were growing tired of the war in Vietnam. We had these major political assassinations like Martin Luther King Jr., President Kennedy, and Malcolm X, for example. And then we get the Stonewall riots and the Kent State Massacre, where National Guardsmen killed 4 peaceful student protesters. So at this point, people are wanting an end to conflict and a healing of the nation. So this makes sense why McGovern would choose Bridge Over Troubled Water as his campaign song. He wanted to be someone that people could rely on for support during these very difficult times and move towards some kind of healing. So this is, again, question number 6, which talks about what made this song appropriate. Another interesting thing you can add is, in some ways, this isn't a typical campaign song, because it has that slow tempo. It's a little bit more low energy, but again, it was meant to be a song representing this need for healing and this move toward hopefully peace. And of course, here is George McGovern, who ran against President Nixon. McGovern was able to use Bridge Over Troubled Water in another way as well. He invited Simon and Garfunkel to participate in a benefit concert that took place in Madison Square Garden on June 14, 1972. Simon actively supported McGovern's candidacy. Garfunkel was less enthusiastic, but eager to perform before a large crowd. McGovern naturally benefited from having star performers take the stage, just as he profited from associating himself with a song that was heard constantly on the radio. However, McGovern was also able to polish his image by bringing the sundered duo back together for the first time since their partnership had ended. He, after all, was a candidate of reconciliation and peacemaking. McGovern's ability to restore the Simon and Garfunkel partnership, therefore, attested to his potential skills as a national leader. So he basically brought the band, the duo, Simon and Garfunkel, back together. That shows that he's able to make peace because they had broken up as a band due to infighting between the two of them. Bridge Over Troubled Water, therefore, was perhaps not as bizarre a choice for a campaign song as one might think. Unfortunately for McGovern, the song did not seem to have done him any good. He was soundly defeated in the 1972 election by incumbent Richard Nixon, who won over 60% of the vote and took every state except Massachusetts in the District of Columbia. In contrast with Simon and Garfunkel's soulful ballad, Tom Petty's 1989 hit I Won't Back Down is an obvious choice for a political candidate. In fact, it is so well suited to the campaign trail that half a dozen candidates have employed it in just the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It was also used to voice a nonpartisan political message following the September 11th terrorist attacks. At the same time, at least one candidate's attempt to co-opt the message and popularity of I Won't Back Down backfired. We will try to understand why the song has been so useful in the context of political discourse and consider the risks for co-opting the creative work of a celebrity for partisan purposes, especially when that celebrity is politically active. So we're moving now into Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne, their song I Won't Back Down. This is a perfect example of a song that has been co-opted many times, sometimes unsuccessfully and without the artist's original support or approval of the co-opting. So we're moving into question number 7. How was the song Won't Back Down by Tom Petty co-opted by politicians, and how does he react to it? By the time he released I Won't Back Down, Tom Petty was already a rock music superstar. Petty was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida, where he dropped out of high school to join a band. He was inspired by Elvis Presley and the Beatles, whose success proved to him that it was possible for a regular, working-class kid to make it in music. Although Petty only achieved local celebrity in his first decade as a rock musician, the late 1970s saw the meteoric rise of his band, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, which recorded a string of successful albums between 1976 and 1987. Although the Heartbreakers would reconvene in the early 1990s and continue to release albums until just a few years before Petty's 2017 death, Petty took a hiatus in 1988 to join George Harrison's group, the Traveling Wilburys. So George Harrison of the Beatles. During this time period, Petty also released his first solo album, Full Moon Fever. The lead single from this album was I Won't Back Down. The lead single from this album was I Won't Back Down. Half of the songs on Full Moon Fever were co-written by Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne, an English musician and founding member of the Traveling Wilburys. It is common for popular songwriters to work in pairs. This strategy has proved successful since the early 20th century, when Tin Pan Alley songwriters teamed up to produce hits. Many songwriters find that this approach aids productivity, since the contributors can help one another out of creative difficulties and suggest improvements to the music or lyrics. Lynne also produced the album and is therefore in part responsible for the sound of I Won't Back Down. So here's Tom Petty here performing on the guitar. The success of I Won't Back Down, both as a popular song and as a political soundtrack, can be traced to its straightforward message. Like Happy Days Are Here Again, I Won't Back Down does not refer to any particular event or circumstances. We don't know what the singer is standing up for, or against whom he is resisting, or why he is in a position that requires he stand his ground. All we know is that despite a world that keeps on pushing me around and dragging me down, the singer won't back down. The music admirably communicates this message of steadfast endurance. I Won't Back Down is set to a medium rock tempo, not so fast as to feel frantic, but not so slow as to feel lethargic. The music sounds as if it, like the singer, could carry on this way forever. The sung melody has a protracted melodic rhythm, meaning that the individual note values are long and unhurried. Petty's unaffected drawl further convinces us that he is not to be moved, while the relaxed guitar solo underscores the point. I Won't Back Down is, naturally enough, in the major mode, but the accompaniment prominently features a minor chord, heard under the word won't in the title line. This tinges the lyric with a seriousness of purpose. Although the singer is not overly concerned, he is not taking the threat lightly. So these are some good points about why this song is so effective in conveying its message of not backing down. It is in the major mode, so it has some confidence to it. It also is at a very medium tempo, and the playing style is quite relaxed on the guitar and the singing in the lyrics as well. Everything sounds relaxed, almost as if the singer is not worried by anything and that he could hold that position all day, like he could keep strumming that guitar in this way all day long. I Went Back Down first made political headlines in 2000 when George W. Bush used it at events during his presidential campaign. The song seemed an excellent choice, but it became a liability when Petty protested, sending the campaign a cease and desist letter and demanding that they quit using his music. Bush's campaign staff might have known better. Petty had already indicated a penchant for political speech as a musician, and had aligned himself with various activist causes. In 1979, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers performed in a Madison Square Garden concert intended to raise support for the dismantling of nuclear power plants. While in 1985, they took to the stage for the famous Live Aid concert in Philadelphia, which raised funds to combat famine in Ethiopia. And in 1992, Petty had written the song "Peace in L.A." in response to the Rodney King riots, donating all proceeds to charity. Although none of these were explicitly left-wing causes, Petty was certainly aware of his power as a political agent, and he knew that music could make a difference in a political struggle. After the 2000 election, Petty performed "I Won't Back Down" at Al Gore's concession speech, thereby clearly sending the message that he intended to retain control over how his music was used. So again, he's not actively working against these people, but rather they used his music without his permission and his express consent. So therefore, he is regaining control over his music and using it for purposes that he believes in, like the Live Aid concert, like the protesting of nuclear power plants that he personally believed in. Petty, however, did not always interfere when politicians co-opted his music. During the 2008 presidential campaign, for example, "I Won't Back Down" was used by Democratic candidates Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, but also by Republican candidate Ron Paul. In 2012, he again made no comment when "I Won't Back Down" was played at the Democratic National Convention. That same year, however, he issued another cease and desist letter to Representative Michelle Bachmann, who used his song "American Girl" to launch her presidential campaign. Petty, of course, was not the first rock star to object to the co-opting of his hits, and also not the last. All modern presidential campaigns are accompanied by a chorus of popular recording artists asking that candidates stop using their music. It's not clear why Petty accepted some uses of his songs and rejected others, but it is entirely clear that he understood the power of his music and celebrity. So we just went over question number 7. How was Tom Petty's song "I Won't Back Down" co-opted by politicians? You can reference the candidates that they mentioned here. You can also go back to the previous slide and talk about the co-opting by President George W. Bush. So we're moving into our next questions. These are all related, 8, 9, and 10. All have to do with Karl Orff, who was a German composer that we'll look at in a second, and his famous piece of music called Carmina Burana. This is a great example of how music has been used for evil purposes and co-opted, again, sometimes without the composer's explicit consent in how it's going to be used exactly. So let's go ahead and jump into questions 8, 9, and 10 here. Here, however, we will examine a 20th century instance of concert music turned to political use. While Karl Orff did not set out to write a political piece of music, his scenic cantata, Carmina Burana, was embraced by the Nazi Party, the leaders of which believed that it conveyed many of their values and could be put to use for the purpose of riling up crowds, and building communal sentiment. Beginning in 1940, Carmina Burana was frequently performed at party rallies and government functions, in which context it both exemplified good Nazi music and was used to boost enthusiasm for the government and its activities. So, looking at Karl Orff, just to put this in context, we're moving into the late 1900s, into the 20th century in the 1900s. So, we're going to see remnants of the Romantic era, but really we're moving into the modernist period of composition later in his life. But I would still call him maybe a late Romantic era composer. Karl Orff was not himself a member of the Nazi Party. After the war, he was investigated by the American denazification authorities, who cleared him of collaboration charges and authorized him to continue his professional work. All the same, Orff thrived under the Nazi regime, and he certainly didn't use his position of relative influence to resist the regime's activities. He never denied the Nazis permission to use his work, and on several occasions actually wrote music on their behalf. Any attempt at subversion, of course, would probably have culminated in Orff's execution. In short, he behaved as many Germans of the era did, neither supporting nor condemning the Nazis. Orff wrote a large number of theatrical works, many of which expressed his theory of elemental music. In attempting to recapture the power of ancient Greek drama, Orff advocated for a unified stage art that combined music, dance, poetry, image, design, and theatrical gesture. If this sounds familiar, we have already seen other creative figures attempt to revive the arts of ancient Greece, like the Florentine Camerata in Chapter 4, and development of an all-encompassing approach to musical theater like Richard Wagner in Chapter 3. Indeed, Orff himself was responsible for the 1925 revival of the most famous opera produced under the Camerata's influence, Claudio Monteverdi's Orpheus. So he brings back Orpheus in his own way. His greatest impact, however, was in the field of music education. He co-founded the Gunther School in Munich in 1924 and taught music there until the end of his life. The techniques he developed for working with young children are still in use today. So Karl Orff, if you've ever heard this name before, there are sets of what we call Orff instruments. These are basically small xylophone instruments designed for teaching children music. So he did, even after this period, have a career in music education, and many of his instruments and teaching strategies are used for teaching early childhood music still. Carmina Burana, certainly Orff's most successful composition, is what he termed a scenic cantata. A cantata is a multi-part work for voices and accompaniment. We examine two cantatas elsewhere in this volume: Barbara Strozzi's Lagrime Mie for solo soprano and basso continuo in Chapter 8, and Johann Sebastian Bach's Sleeper's Wake for soloist, choir, and orchestra, covered later in Chapter 11. Cantata, however, is a flexible designation. Just as Strozzi and Bach's cantatas have little in common, Orff's cantata will in turn bear only a limited resemblance to other cantatas you might have encountered. His addition of the term scenic indicates that his cantatas are meant to be staged. Orff envisioned dramatic performances complete with sets, costumes, pantomime, and dancing. Carmina Burana was indeed presented as a dramatic spectacle in its early days, although now you are more likely to encounter it as an unstaged concert work. Today, Carmina Burana seems to have completely shed its wartime significance. Few people know that it was ever used as Nazi propaganda, and is widely enjoyed by audiences and performers. This is in part possible because the text has nothing whatever to do with politics, war, or Nazi values. Indeed, the text is nearly 1,000 years old. Orff extracted it from a medieval manuscript of the same name. Carmina Burana is Latin for Songs from Benediktbeuern, and refers to a volume of poems written primarily in the 11th and 12th centuries. The manuscript containing the poems was discovered at a Benedictine monastery in Benediktbeuern, now a municipality in Bavaria, and is prized as one of the most significant collections of what are known as Goliard songs. So, we've already touched on a little bit here of question number 8. how is this piece, Carmina Burana, which was used as Nazi propaganda, how is it able to shed its wartime significance? It's a piece that is still performed today, but most people don't know this history. The answer really comes from what is the source material. Carmina Burana really has nothing to do with Nazi values in its core, even though it was co-opted for those reasons. But really, its origins come from this collection of songs called the Songs from Benediktbeuern. We'll take a look at this, but this comes from a Benedictine monastery. This is a religious monastery of monks that we'll learn more about on the next slide that came from Germany or Bavaria. Goliards were, in modern terms, carousing college dropouts. Many were younger sons from wealthy families. Because only the eldest son could inherit, younger sons were sent to monasteries or Catholic universities where they were educated in theology and prepared to enter the clergy. Many of these young men, however, had no affinity for the religious life, and instead preferred to pursue more earthly pleasures. Because they had been well educated, Goliaths were able to leave a record of their satirical poems and racy songs. Most of these were written in Latin, the language spoken by the Catholic Church, although some are in the vernacular language spoken by the Goliards. The songs in the Carmina Burana manuscript address all of the topics that might interest young men who enjoy having a good time. The fickleness of fortune and wealth, the ephemeral nature of life, the joy of the return of spring, drinking, gluttony, gambling, and lust. Few of the texts can be associated with specific melodies, meaning that a composer who wanted to borrow them would be obliged to create new musical settings. Orff did so, although he often sought to imitate the melodic shapes and modes of Gregorian chant. We'll learn more about Gregorian chant in chapter 11 as well. So we see here, what were the Goliards? This is question number 9. And what were the songs that they wrote in the Songs of Benediktbeuern about? What was the subject matter? So you can say that they were essentially college dropouts or carousing college dropouts, younger sons from wealthy families who had to be sent to monasteries or Catholic universities to become part of the church or the clergy, but they really did not have those desires. It was really the only option presented to them. So instead, they used their time, also writing these satirical poems and very funny songs sometimes about these topics presented down here. Taken as a whole, however, Orff's music is far removed from that of the medieval Catholic Church. He wrote for an enormous ensemble consisting of 3 vocal soloists, 3 choirs, 2 mixed and 1 boys' choir, and a large orchestra complete with an 18-piece percussion section and 2 pianos. His music was inspired by Igor Stravinsky's primitivist ballets, like chapter 3's reference to Rite of Spring, which use repetitive melodic figures like ostinatos and jarring rhythms to evoke a pre-modern social order. To create his scenic cantata, Orff first chose 23 poems from the manuscript and organized them into scenes, which address the topics of fate, springtime, drinking, and love. The first and last scenes are identical, for they portray Fortune, Empress of the world. The vision of Fortune as a great wheel that turns incessantly can be found throughout the Carmina Burana manuscript, where it is represented both in verse and image. It therefore seemed natural to Orff that his cantata should end as it had begun, with a mighty chorus announcing the power of fate to shape our lives. We will examine 4 musical selections, one representing each of the 4 themes explored in Carmina Burana. So this is an important part of this piece is the Wheel of Fate, or Fortune, Empress of the World, they call it. So this is a portrayal here. Let's read this. For Fortune, as portrayed in the Carmina Burana manuscript, her wheel raises kings to the heights while crushing peasants below. However, because the wheel is constantly turning, those on the bottom can hope for an improvement in their fortunes, while those on the top must remember that they will not remain there forever. So the wheel of fate, the peasants on the bottom, the kings at the top, but knowing that these things do change over time. That was a big part of this idea of fortune or fate that dictates our lives. And again, this comes from the manuscript of the Goliard monks or clergymen who wrote these satirical poems. The opening chorus, O Fortune, is certainly the most famous part of Carmina Burana. It has been featured in dozens of films, television shows, commercials, and video games, and has even been employed by professional sports teams. Its text consists of 3 stanzas. They're right here. O fortune like the moon, ever-changing state, you are always waxing or waning. Hateful life now is brutal, now pampers our feelings with its game. Poverty, power, it melts them like ice. Fate, savage and empty, you are a turning wheel. Your position is uncertain, your favor is idle and always likely to disappear. Covered in shadows and veiled, you bear upon me too. Now my back is naked through the sport of your wickedness. The chance of prosperity and of virtue is not now mine. Whether willing or not, a man is always liable for fortune's service. At this hour, without delay, touch the strings, because through luck she lays low the brave. All join me in lamentation. So this is the text from Carmina Burana talking about, again, fortune and fate. The music is simple in the extreme. After a shockingly loud introduction in which the full chorus and orchestra sound like a series of accented chords, the instruments of the orchestra set an ostinato into motion. The ostinato, which is a repeating rhythm figure, contains only 4 pitches, each of which is sharply accented. Over the top of this ostinato, the chorus sings a melody constructed out of repeated melodic and rhythmic fragments. Almost all of the melodic motion is conjunct, and the entire melody occupies the tiny range of a fifth. So again, a fifth is a type of musical interval. They're saying that this has a small range and is using conjunct motion, so not a lot of big leaps between notes, but very comfortable to sing. All the notes are right next to each other on the piano or in the human voice. Some commentators have compared this melody to Gregorian chant, while others have remarked upon its folk-like qualities. So again, this might sound like folk music in its simplicity, but also Gregorian chant, early church music, was also the same thing. Easy to sing, often conjunct motion without a whole lot of big jumps. The first 2 verses are musically identical, but the third is marked by an explosion in volume. The sopranos repeat their melody, but they do so an octave higher than before. Likewise, high register instruments join the ostinato. In the final moments of the movement, the pattern finally breaks as a new 6th note ostinato takes us to the final thrilling chord. Orff's music certainly conveys the power and inescapability of fate. So this is part of question number 10, talking about the different parts of Carmina Burana, starting with O Fortune. Tell me 3 musical attributes mentioned in this song, and listen for it in the recording right here. Make sure that you listen to it. I bet you've heard this piece many times before, even if you didn't know the name or who it was by or where it was from. A couple important things that you can mention are conjunct motion, narrow melodic range, those kind of go together, folk-like qualities or qualities similar to Gregorian chant, um, these really, really loud dynamics, fortissimo volume, you could say, or fortissimo dynamic. And of course, the different types of rhythmic ostinatos of different small note combinations. So sometimes a 4-note ostinato with just 4 notes or pitches, and sometimes a 6-note ostinato that makes this very thrilling but also somewhat repetitive. So again, check this out. Great recording. The next selection we will consider has quite a different mood. It is an instrumental movement from the springtime scene entitled simply Dance, or Tons. All the same, Dance shares a great deal in common with O Fortune. Orff opens the movement with a series of dramatic chords, after which he uses ostinatos to underpin a melody that is itself full of melodic repetition. And once again, that melody moves primarily by step and occupies only a small range. Dance feels a bit more rhythmically unpredictable than O Fortuna. This is due to the fact that the meter changes frequently, which prevents a steady pulse from being established. Try tapping your toe along to the music. It should be very difficult. A further sense of liveliness is produced by metric disagreements between the ostinato and the melody. Often, the strong pulses in each layer do not line up. Dance is in the ternary form. We've seen this term before. It's a 3-part form. I always like to tell people too, it has turn in the name. So it is 3 parts, but it is also going A, B going to something new, and then returning back to the A. So this is a very simple ternary form ABA. The first A section features strings, which composers often employ to bring pastoral scenes to life. So again, pastoral means wide open pastures. Think sheep and shepherds and beautiful nature scenes. The flute, which carries the melody in the B section, is even better suited to shepherd life. This middle passage is unusual, for we hear only the flute and timpani, a rare pairing to be sure. Finally, the A melody returns in the horns and trumpets. As in O Fortuna, the music builds to an exciting and noisy final chord. So, an interesting pairing here too. The timpani drums, the big kettle drums, and the smaller flute, right? So 2 instruments that we don't always hear in a duo format are featured within this orchestral piece. So again, take some time to list some of the musical details presented here. You can mention ternary form, you can mention the instrument pairing, you can mention the asymmetrical meter and changes in rhythmic meter that makes this sound like a dance, but also makes it kind of unpredictable. And again, a great recording here of Dance or Tanz from Carmina Burana by Carl Orff. Our third example will provide still further contrast, for it features one of the humorous texts that Orff chose to include in his cantata. Once I had dwelt on lakes is narrated from the perspective of a roast swan as he waits his fate on a banquet table. The lyrics are, once I had dwelt on lakes, once I had been beautiful when I was a swan. Poor wretch, now black and well roasted. The cook turns me back and forth, I am roasted to a turn on my pyre. Now the waiter serves me. Poor wretch, now black and well roasted. Now I lie on the dish, and I cannot fly. I see the gnashing teeth. Poor wretch, now black and well roasted. Each of these 3 stanzas concludes with a refrain, which is sung by the men of the choir. The part of the swan is played by the tenor soloist, who sings at the top of his range. The resulting sound, which is often tense and pinched, can be heard as an imitation of the swan's own voice. We also hear the swan in the opening bassoon solo, played at the top of the instrument's range. Finally, the fluttering sound in the strings and flute might capture the swan's trepidation as he contemplates his impending fate. Once again, repetitive melodies that are also, in the case of that sung by the choir, stepwise and limited to a narrow range, are underpinned by ostinatos. So here, you can mention rhythmic ostinato, you can mention the narrow range, the fluttering sounds of the strings, imitating trepidation, the bassoon and the tenor, both tenor solo singer, both using a pinched or nasal sound to showcase the voice of the swan. And also interesting is the refrain that is always sung by the whole choir of men. Right here, poor wretch, now black and well roasted. A refrain is something that is concluding each of the lines. And again, check out that recording on the previous slide. Pause the video and make sure that you listen to each of these a little bit, because we will be testing listening later on in the semester too. Here's the last one. It's called It Is the Time of Joy. We got 2 more, sorry. Finally, we will examine a selection, or to be fair, a pair of selections from the scene dealing with love. We are not talking about romantic love, however, but carnal lust. The text to It Is the Time of Joy and the short response number, Sweetest of Men, outline the courtship of a woman by a young man who is consumed with desire. She ultimately accedes. The text says, It is the time of joy, O maidens now, enjoy yourselves together, O young men. And then the refrain, oh, I am all a flower, now with my first love I am all afire, a new love it is of which I am dying. I am elated when I say yes, I am depressed when I say no. Refrain. In the time of winter a man is sluggish, when is in his heart he is wanton. Refrain. My innocence plays with me, my shyness pushes me back. Again the refrain. Come, my mistress, with your joy, come, fair girl, already I die. Refrain. Sweetest of men, I give myself to you wholly. The musical example is dominated by percussion and piano, which keeps up a lively rhythmic accompaniment. The verses are sung alternately by the women and the men of the choir, while the refrain is sung alternately by the baritone solos in the boys' choir. The complete vocal forces come together for the final verse-refrain pair. Every pair is sung to the same melody, but the timbral variations introduced by the changes in singers keeps the music from getting stale. So this one, a little bit less to talk about, but you can mention the use of the refrain, the use of different parts of the choir or different choirs to say the same lines. So we're giving different kind of contrast, even though we hear the same refrain and lines pretty much throughout. The variation comes from the use of different singers. They call it timbral variation. So check this one out. It is a time of joy. And now here's the last one. Sweetest of Men could hardly be more different from It is the Time of Joy. In place of the percussive ostinatos, the orchestra sustains a single harmony. The solo soprano soars to the top of her range, carrying the fifth vowel of her text through a long passage of notes. This is known as a melismatic passage, and it contrasts sharply with the syllabic character of the previous number, in which every syllable was paired with a single note. The selection can be heard in fairly graphic terms, as the satisfying fulfillment of a sexual encounter, which was communicated by all the bumps and bangs of the previous number. So here's an important term to note is melismatic. We'll look at this more with Gregorian chant and some other vocal music, but the idea of a melisma is when you say one word, you're actually passing through several different pitches. So this is what we call a melismatic. It sounds very smooth, but we can hear that one word is used and usually linked to several different notes, like a scale, for example. This particular moment also got Orff into trouble with the authorities, for the Nazi regime did not take kindly to the glamorization of improper social behaviors. The Soviet regime was equally prudish, as exemplified by its response to Dmitri Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of the Minsk district, which is detailed in the final section of this chapter. In fact, Herbert Gehrig, a leading ideological voice in the Nazi Party, registered several objections to Carmina Burana when he reviewed the premiere. He found fault in the language of the text, which was incomprehensible to German listeners, the primitive character of the music, which he considered to reflect the influence of jazz, a musical style that was widely denigrated and strictly forbidden, and the loose morals on exhibit in the cantata. So you have a couple notes here about the music within Sweetest of Men. Listen to the track right here. But we're already looking at some interesting ways that someone who is writing under these conditions, like writing under the Nazi Party, you might be writing things that could be offensive to these people, right? So you have to be very careful if you were Karl Orff in this case. It also shows how these governments were trying to control the music and the art that people were experiencing. Nonetheless, it was another interpretation of Carmina Burana that won official acceptance. The Nazi official Horst Büttner regarded the work as exemplifying the radiant strength-filled life joy of the folk. He also pointed out that the poems were artifacts of German folk heritage, and therefore to be treasured as national literature. Finally, Büttner connected the rhythms and melodies with German folk music, thereby identifying Carmina Burana as an authentic expression of German identity. When used in the context of political gatherings, Carmina Burana had the added value of encouraging powerful and unambiguous collective emotional reactions. It seemed to echo Hitler's call for Germans to think with your blood. This was the kind of music that can inspire support for the regime on a purely physical level. So it was seen as music that represented the folk people and the folk tradition, and there was something so exciting about it that even if you couldn't understand what was being said or didn't know the stories, the music itself and some of the subject matter was wide appealing to the audiences. Okay, so we're moving now into question 11. We're on slide 37 here. We're looking not at campaign songs now, but in fact protest songs. What do they have in common, and in what ways are protest songs unique to campaign songs? We'll see this on slides 37 and 38. So here's music as political protest. Just as music can be used to express confidence in a candidate or government, to win support for a political cause, it can also be used to protest the actions of those in power. Because these two objectives are similar, campaign songs and protest songs generally have certain characteristics in common. The elements that usually make for a good campaign song, like non-specific lyrical content, catchy melodies, energetic rhythms, and a hopeful mood, also tend to make for an effective protest song. In both cases, after all, the song is supposed to inspire those who hear it to rally in support of a political action. So already we see some things in common mentioned here. Again, put that in your own words and shape your response. Let's continue. However, there are some important differences in the way that campaign songs and protest songs are used. So here's the differences. Campaign songs are usually broadcast over loudspeakers at live events or perhaps performed by a band. They might also be included in television advertisements. In all these contexts, campaign songs are passively consumed by the audience. They play an important role in setting a mood and establishing a campaign's brand, but their potential effectiveness is limited to their sound and lyrics. Protest songs, on the other hand, are most often performed by the protesters themselves. They are not passively consumed, but collectively voiced in a participatory context. Therefore, the sound of the song as a commercial product is not of paramount importance. What does matter is that the song be fairly simple in terms of text and melody so that participants can learn it quickly, and so that even the least accomplished singer will be able to join in. Protest songs differ from campaign songs in another important way as well, for they are likely to be expressly written for political use. At the same time, protest songs are often co-opted by movements that are far removed from their original context, and may or not have the explicit support of the song's creator. And, just as a non-political song can be adopted by a campaign, a non-political song can be deployed in support of a protest movement. Once again, therefore, we will see how creative artists cannot be guaranteed to retain control over the meaning or use of their own works. So, continuing with music as political protest, we'll get Florence Reese and her song, Which Side Are You On? Our first example was certainly intended as a protest, and pointed personal protest at that. The creator of the song was not a popular performing artist, but an impoverished union organizer in rural Kentucky, unknown outside of her own community until long after the song was written. She did not have commercial success in her mind, but rather the immediate survival of her family, which had been targeted for destruction by a powerful oppressive force. Florence Reese was the daughter and wife of coal miners. Born in Tennessee, she married Sam Reese at the age of 16 and moved with him to Harlan County, Kentucky. It was there that a bloody conflict between mine workers and owners, known as the Harlan County War, would play out between 1931 and 39. In addition to fighting to protect her family, Florence documented the period in poems and songs that both reflected her desperate situation and called on fellow members of the mining community to maintain the struggle. During World War I, the coal mining industry enjoyed a boom in production. Coal, after all, was needed for the production of steel, of which the war effort required an endless supply. Although coal companies saw the greatest profits, individual coal miners also lived comfortably during this period. Because there was enormous demand for their labor, the United Mine Workers (UMW), the union that represented coal miners, was able to secure high wages on their behalf. So during World War I, we had a huge need for coal and the creation of steel. So therefore, mine workers were highly valued, and they got good pay and overall profitability for both the workers and the owners of these coal mines. So we're jumping right into question 12 now. What led to the shifting demand for coal and the poor conditions of the coal miners during the 20s and 30s? What conditions and practices were Florence Reese protesting against? So we need to learn a little bit about this labor movement right here. Following armistice, however, so the end of World War I, coal companies failed to scale back their production, with the result that the market was overwhelmed and prices dropped precipitously. Many coal miners were fired, while those who remained on the job saw their wages cut again and again. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression hit, and conditions for mine workers became even worse. The UMW found that it had lost its bargaining power and withdrew, leaving workers without advocacy. So this is part of the breaking down of the unions, where workers now have no bargaining power in what their rates are or what their working conditions might be. And a steady drop in the need for the number of mine workers too. Miners who had lost their jobs or found the conditions intolerable could not simply leave. To begin with, the work was scarce in the early 1930s. It was the structure of the mining industry, however, that posed the greatest challenges. Miners lived in company towns that were owned and operated by the mining conglomerates. They could not buy their own homes and were reliant on the company store for household goods and groceries, stores that often inflated prices and encouraged mine employees to go into debt. Miners who wanted to leave often were not able to do so, since they owed money to their employer, while those who lost their jobs simultaneously became homeless. Another union stepped in to fight on behalf of the desperate miners, whose labor was still necessary to keep the industry going. That union, the National Miners Union, was backed by the American Communist Party, and it was willing to undertake extreme actions. The mine owners, on the other hand, were able to buy the support of local sheriffs, the state militia, and the court system. They even hired Chicago gangsters to take out union leaders. The ensuing conflict resulted in countless deaths on both sides, including hundreds of children and infants who starved to death or were denied medical services by the company doctors. So we see here really awful working conditions. Many would say, as a result of capitalism, the fact that the owners of the mines are not willing to give their workers a living wage. In fact, they make them, they have to buy these houses that belong to the miners, so they live in their spaces, they pay them rent, and they're buying from their stores too with inflated prices. So this is the equivalent of maybe someone who works for Walmart who buys all their groceries from Walmart and can't afford to buy the food, or who can't afford medical pay, medical insurance because of their employer, right? So workers' rights is a huge issue presented here in this section of the chapter. So this is still part of question number 12, the final slide here, 41. One particular skirmish prompted Florence Reese to create Which Side Are You On? Sam Reese was a Union leader and therefore a target for the company-backed law enforcement. One day, Sheriff J.H. Blair arrived at the Reese home with his men. They ransacked the house in front of Florence and her 7 terrified children, and then settled in to wait for Sam, with the intention of shooting him dead when he arrived. Sam, however, had been warned about the raid and did not return home that day. After the men left at nightfall, Florence tore a calendar off the wall and wrote the text to her song on the back. Florence Reese was a lyricist, not a composer, and when she wrote songs, she sang the words to familiar pre-existing melodies. For Which Side Are You On? She chose the melody of an old Baptist hymn, which she knew as Lay the Lily Low. The same melody is used for the traditional ballad, known variously as Jack Monroe, Jack Went A-Sailing, and The Maid of Chatham. The ballad is probably of British origin and therefore can be considered a likely source for the hymn melody known to Reese. So here you can see different listening examples. One is Which Side Are You On? The other is Jack Went A-Sailing, or Layla the Lily down here as well. So inspiration for this top example by Florence Reese, Which Side Are You On? The hymn melody was a natural and effective choice. As a committed Christian, Reese would have been likely to select tunes that she had learned in the context of worship. This particular tune is simple and easy to sing. It is also a bit ominous, giving its minor mode and descending melody. The last tone of each phrase is the lowest. As a result, the tune cannily captures the spirit of Reese's message. Reese's message is straightforward and unadorned. She does not rely on poetic imagery or metaphor, and she doesn't need to. In the first stanza, she praises the Union. In the second, she announces that victory is assured. In the third, she makes it clear that everyone involved in the conflict must choose a side, calling out the sheriff who threatened her family by the name. In the fourth, she brings in her concern about the children of miners. In the fifth, she exhorts miners to be honest and brave. In the sixth, she proclaims her mining heritage and incorporates her only flight of poetic fancy, referring movingly to her deceased father as "in the air and sun." And in the seventh, not heard in our recording, she returns to the theme of collective strength through unionization. The chorus, a simple question, repeated 4 times, drives home the message without any ambiguity. So the chorus is, "Which side are you on?" Reese did not record her song until much later in life. When she did so, she sang in the simple, unadorned style of many Appalachian ballad singers. She sings without accompaniment, just as she would have in 1931. Her words have a force that comes not only from her personal experiences, but from her knowledge that they continue to be relevant. Although the Harlan County miners emerged victorious in 1939, another conflict would take place in 1973, when 180 miners' employees by the Eastover Coal Company's Brookside Mine and Prep Plant went on strike for improved working conditions and decent wages. Reese joined the strikers in solidarity, and her rendition of "Which Side Are You On?" before a crowd of miners and their families was recorded in the documentary Harlan County, USA. Reese's song first gained mainstream popularity when it was recorded in 1941 by the Almanac Singers, a folk revival group based in New York City and led by Pete Seeger. The Almanac Singers were actively engaged with left-wing politics, and they were interested in supporting the labor movement. Their version employs guitar and banjo accompaniment and features a large group of singers on the chorus, a sonic representation of the collective workers represented by the union. The song was later recorded by dozens of other artists, and it has been used in protests around the world. So here is Pete Seeger's recording of the same song, "Which Side Are You On?", which we can see has been kind of a constant in the fight for workers' rights. It is not surprising that a folk revival group like the Almanac Singers would record Reese's protest song. Participants in the folk revival movement were almost universally preoccupied with social justice issues, and its singers would both record and create countless protest anthems. In fact, it is difficult to select a representative example. Bob Dylan's classic "Blowin' in the Wind", however, will serve our purpose well. It will allow us to consider the connection between style and message, to examine the typical characteristics of a successful protest song, and to consider the ways in which a protest song can mean something to listeners and singers that was never intended by its creators. So we're going to look at Bob Dylan, "Blowin' in the Wind", one of my favorite songs, actually. The folk revival movement began in the 1930s, when young people in northern cities began to take an interest in the songs and tunes of rural Southern musicians. The movement was largely driven by field collectors, the most prominent of which were the father-son team of John and Alan Lomax. Collectors would travel through rural communities recording folk artists. In fact, it was Alan Lomax who collected "Which Side Are You On?" from Florence Reese in 1937. Sometimes, collectors would actually bring rural performers up north to perform on college campuses and at folk festivals. For the most part, however, the folk revival was driven by northern musicians performing the songs they learned from field recordings, using the same acoustic instruments, especially the guitar, that were common in the South. So we just passed through question 13. What was the folk revival movement that began in the 1930s? And we'll see later what role does it play in the 1960s on this slide here. Although the folk revival was sparked during the Great Depression, it did not exert mainstream influence until the 1960s, when the counterculture movement adopted folk music as a favored means of expression. The 1960s saw extraordinary social upheaval, as young people rebelled against the conservative social values of the post-World War II era. Marginalized groups fought for civil rights, and anti-war activists protested U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Folk music quickly became an important vehicle for political speech. Most of the central figures in the folk revival did not become famous performing authentic folk music. Instead, they wrote and recorded original songs in a folk style. Perhaps the most influential and respected of these artists was Bob Dylan, who produced an extraordinary catalog of songs featuring his own evocative poetry. Dylan was regarded as a folk singer because he accompanied himself on acoustic guitar and harmonica, but he was more interested in expressing himself creatively than in preserving music of the past. Bob Dylan was born Robert Allen Zimmerman to Midwestern Jewish parents in 1941. He moved to New York in 1961, where he legally changed his name while still using a variety of pseudonyms to record and publish his creative work. Dylan's eponymous first album, released in 1962 by Columbia Records, consisted mostly of familiar folk and gospel songs. It was hardly a success, barely breaking even in financial terms, and skeptics within Columbia recommended that his contract be terminated. Dylan's producers stood by him, however, and his second album, The Free Willin' Bob Dylan, was considerably more successful. The album's songs were decidedly topical, addressing political concerns ranging from integration to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first song on the album was Blowin' in the Wind. And here's the album cover for The Free Willin' Bob Dylan. Blowin' in the Wind is in 3 stanzas, each of which concludes with a refrain. Each of the stanzas consists of a series of 3 questions, the answer to which is promised by the refrain, even though it is never in fact provided. So he promises an answer to these questions but doesn't actually give it. Within each stanza, the questions become increasingly pointed and specific. The first in each set tends to be vague. It does not connect with a social issue and cannot be ascribed specific meaning. The later questions, however, begin to make explicit reference to ongoing political crises. Mentions of cannonballs and deaths clearly conjure the image of war, while the lament that some people are still not allowed to be free elicits scenes of oppression at home and abroad. However, despite the growing specificity and attendant urgency of the questions, Dylan never makes the subject of his song exactly clear. He is concerned about war, but which war? He laments oppression, but whose oppression? We can easily guess what was on his mind in 1962 when he wrote the song. The Vietnam War, which had been ongoing since 1955, was beginning to attract significant opposition in the United States, while the Civil Rights Movement was quickly gaining momentum. Dylan became particularly involved in the struggle for racial equality. He performed at the 1963 March on Washington, and his third album, The Times They Are A-Changin', contained a number of songs that addresses the struggles and victories of equal rights campaigners. So this is the 1963 March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King. We might therefore imagine that we know what this song meant to Dylan, but that does not mean that the significance of Blowin' in the Wind is limited to the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Dylan himself ensured that his songs could speak to political issues beyond his own time and place. He did so by refraining from mentioning the social causes of his day and instead speaking in broad, almost universal terms. His concerns about war and freedom apply just as well to ancient struggles as they do to those that have yet to take place. We might draw a contrast here with Reese's song, which explicitly mentions mining and even names one of her adversaries. So this is one difference in Bob Dylan and Florence Reese, is that he is being much more vague and talking about universal truths about history that can also be applied to future conflicts as well, whereas Price's was much more direct. It talks about her real mission of mining and protecting the mining workers and families, but also naming her adversary. So she's being much more specific, meaning that her song can't be used for just any purpose, whereas Dylan's can really suit a variety of social causes. Dylan's music suits his message. Each of the questions begins with the same melodic phrase and ends on an inconclusive pitch, indicating that there's more to be said. While his refrain, which promises an answer, ends on the home pitch, the tonic scale degree, the melody is highly repetitive, making it easy to learn. It also encompasses only a small vocal range and moves almost entirely by step, conjunct motion, making it easy to sing. Finally, the simple guitar accompaniment can be replicated by a moderately competent player. In short, this song, which requires neither special equipment nor advanced musical training, can be performed by almost anybody. However, Dylan's melody also carries a meaning on a deeper level. Like Reese, he did not write his melody from scratch, but rather adapted it from another song. His source, the African-American spiritual No More Auction Block, provides us with additional insight into what the song might mean. For No More Auction Block describes the relief of a formerly enslaved person who has escaped from slavery and is no longer to be subjected to humiliations and abuses. According to Alan Lomax, the song originated in Canada, where it was sung by former slaves after the practice was abolished there. It later spread to the United States. Dylan's melody is not identical, but one can easily hear that he borrowed the opening melodic phrase. When we listen through the lens of the spiritual, we can even feel more confident about the relationship between Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind and the civil rights movement. So here is the recording of No More Auction Block, a influence on Bob Dylan and his song Blowin' in the Wind, and also for the fight for civil rights. Please listen to that. And we're coming to the end here of question 14, which was, what political message could this song have signified at the time of its release? And in what ways does Bob Dylan's song lend itself to be a great protest song? So we already mentioned anti-Vietnam War, or just anti-war sentiments in general as protest, also relations to the civil rights movement. But part of what makes that song so good as a protest song is that he is non-specific. So therefore, it can be used to meet a variety of different protests or fights for social justices. Okay, we're moving now. Here's the last little bit from Bob Dylan. But we can't go too far in describing specific meaning to Blowin' in the Wind. Dylan himself refused to explain what the song meant, or even to admit that it had anything in particular to mean. When the song was published in Sing Out magazine in 1962, it was accompanied by the following note from Dylan. He says, "There ain't too much I can say about this song except that the answer is blowin' in the wind. It ain't in no book or movie or TV show or discussion group. Man, it's in the wind, and it's blowing in the wind. Too many of these hip people are telling me where the answer is, but oh, I won't believe that. I still say it's in the wind, and just like a restless piece of paper, it's got to come down some. But the only trouble is no one picks up the answer when it comes down, so too many people get to see and know. And then it flies away. I still say that some of the biggest criminals are those that turn their heads away when they see wrong and know it's wrong. In other words, Blowin' in the Wind is about searching for answers, not providing them." So I love this idea, the idea of when you see wrong, knowing it's wrong, and not just turning your head away from injustices in the world. This is a huge point, and again, he's getting us to ask questions and rethink things instead of telling us directly that something is bad. Dylan went even further in distancing his song from the political turmoil of the early 1960s, stating clearly before its first ever performance, this here ain't no protest song or anything like that, 'cause I don't write no protest songs. It's easy to understand why Dylan, an artist with a wide creative ranging vision, would not want to be pigeonholed as a writer of protest songs. All the same, his claim rings hollow, especially in the light of the many activists who were inspired by the song and the social movements that have adopted it. We will examine two recordings of Blowin' in the Wind, both made in 1963. First, we will listen to Bob Dylan's own version, which was released as a single and included as the lead track on his second album. This version was moderately successful. The freewheelin' Bob Dylan peaked at 22 on the Billboard album charts. However, Dylan's songs have almost always done better when sung by other performers. We will also listen to the version by the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary, who can be considered responsible for making Blowin' in the Wind a hit. Their recording reached number 2 on the Billboard singles charts. So same song, but covered by a different group, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Dylan's version is remarkably simple and unpolished. He plays a regular guitar rhythm on the guitar, choosing the most obvious chords. He only uses 3. At the end of each verse, he pauses to blow a few notes on the harmonica. His timing as a singer was always idiosyncratic, and sometimes the words don't fall on the beat, as you would expect. His voice is rough, and he doesn't seem to put any effort into expressing the meaning of the text. So he's really singing in the style of a folk singer because he's part of that folk revival movement. They're much more interested in just stating the words and having them mean what they mean without having to put a lot of intention behind them. So I would encourage you, this is a great song if you've never heard it. Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan. This is his original 1963 version. The version recorded by Peter, Paul, and Mary is considerably more sophisticated. Although the group also accompanies their singing with guitars, they use two instruments, not one, and the guitars are played using a refined finger-picking style that is far removed from Dylan's simple strumming. So more sophisticated guitar, and they're using two guitars, so already we're getting more complexity. We hear the guitars right at the beginning when they provide an extended introduction to the song. Peter, Paul, and Mary also chose more nuanced and compelling harmonies than Dylan had. As a result, their version is significantly more difficult for an amateur to replicate. All three members of the group were singers, and they used this to their advantage by varying the vocal texture phrase by phrase. The first verse begins in two-part harmony with Mary Travers on the melody, but grows in volume and energy when a third voice enters to underscore the final question. When the men sing the first refrain without Mary, who subsequently sings the first question in the second verse alone, all three take the second question in unison, and the third in harmony before Mary sings the second refrain as a solo. The third verse builds into a climax as Mary moves from the melody to a high harmony, after which she sings the final refrain alone. All three provide a final unison refrain to close out the recording. The changes in texture draw the listener's attention to some of the more important questions. The one about freedom is especially forceful, while also making the song more interesting. So here we see Peter, Paul, and Mary, and here's the cover for their single Blowin' in the Wind, the Bob Dylan cover. Finally, Peter, Paul, and Mary's version has a polish that is lacking in Dylan's. The rhythms are regular and predictable, while the voices of the singers are carefully controlled and perfectly in tune. This is not to say that Peter, Paul, and Mary's version is better, and many people prefer Dylan's recordings for its simplicity and honesty. However, this comparison gives us some insight into what makes a hit. It is not only the singer that matters, but the arrangement and performance. So you can listen for the difference. Here is the Peter, Paul, and Mary version of the same song, Blowin' in the Wind, that we're going to be calling more refined. But again, I think for Bob Dylan, he's going for that folk style. He cares less about the refinement and more about conveying the song in a simple way. So obviously, it was influential, or this group wouldn't have covered it, even though their version was maybe more of a radio hit at the time, or a Billboard hit. I think that Bob Dylan's version is still timeless and probably the people that most people know. But check out both. They're both amazing performers and great versions of this song. This next section, continuing music as political protest, we have Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, their song Get Up, Stand Up. And here, of course, we see the very famous Bob Marley. In our previous example, style played an important role in the construction of a successful protest song. On the one hand, the acoustic instruments and simplified techniques of the folk revival made Blowin' in the Wind easy to perform and also appropriate for informal outdoor renditions in the context of rallies, marches, or picket lines. On the other, the folk style positioned Blowin' in the Wind in a long line of protest songs, of which Side Are You On is an early example. In other words, it is typical for a folk song to also be a protest song, and listeners, therefore, have an easy time accepting Blowing in the Wind in this role. Style will also be an important part of our next example. Some characteristics of the reggae style, which relies on a range of amplified electronic instruments, make Get Up, Stand Up from 1973 somewhat more difficult to use in the context of an on-the-ground protest. At the same time, reggae itself is deeply connected with social rebellion and resistance to oppressive ruling powers, so much so that the genre itself might be considered a protest. In the case of this song, therefore, a knowledge of the reggae style and its historical context is vital to understanding the message of the music. Reggae has been around since 1968, when it emerged as the most widely performed and influential style of popular music in Jamaica. Reggae represented a synthesis of various music traditions of Central and North America. Jamaican listeners had easy access to American popular music, which was imported on recorded discs and broadcast on the radio, and they were particularly enthusiastic about rhythm and blues and jazz. Following Jamaican independence in 1962, uh, however, Jamaicans were increasingly interested in developing a unique popular music style that represented their own national identity. The first of these were ska, an up-tempo style featuring jazz instrumentation and offbeat accents, and rock steady, a slower version of ska, both of which influenced reggae. Ska and rocksteady also drew from the Caribbean traditions of mento and calypso, as did reggae in its own turn. So we already saw calypso from Trinidad and Tobago, for example. The meaning of the Jamaican English term reggae has been much debated. It can be used to refer to a person who is poorly dressed or to a quarrel. It has also been connected with the term strege, which can be used to describe a loose woman. The term was first used in a musical context in the Maytals' 1968 song "Do the Reggae", which also established the stylistic conventions of what would become a major new genre. The lead singer of the group, Frederick Toots Hibbert, provided his own definition of the term. Reggae just means coming from the people, an everyday thing, like from the ghetto. When you say reggae, you mean regular, majority. And when you say reggae, it means poverty, suffering. Rastafari, everything in the ghetto. It's music from the rebels, people who don't have what they want. Reggae music, therefore, would speak to regular Jamaicans, and it would address their rebellious desire to overthrow the forces that kept them in poverty. So really, when you think about it, is this that different from what Florence Reese was trying to do with her protest songs for the mining company, right? A desire to overthrow the forces that are keeping you deliberately in poverty. Hibbert also mentions Rastafarianism, which is another vital ingredient to reggae. We can understand neither that the reggae worldview nor the specific lyrics of reggae songs without addressing this movement. Rastafarianism can trace its roots to the Back to Africa movement of the 1920s. The leader of the movement was Marcus Garvey, a fiery political orator of Jamaican origin who advocated for Pan-African unity. In his view, those of African descent in all parts of the world should take pride in their heritage and throw off the yoke of white colonial oppression. He sought independence for black majority colonial states, but also encouraged members of the African diaspora to return to Africa, where he imagined the founding of a single unified African state with himself as the head. While organizing in the United States, Garvey went so far as to establish a shipping company, the Black Star Line, for the express purpose of returning African Americans to the African continent. This project, however, led to Garvey's 1923 convention for mail fraud, after which he was deported. Back in Jamaica, Garvey prophesied that the liberation of the entire African diaspora would be sparked by the crowning of a black king in Africa. He founded his claim in an interpretation of the Book of Revelation, which foretells the rise of the Lion of Judah. When the Ethiopian regent Rastafari Makonnen became Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930, therefore, Garvey and others believed that the prophecy had been fulfilled. Selassie, whose full title included the designation Lion of the Tribe of Judah, traced his own lineage back to the King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Selassie himself was an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, and he disdained the prophecies that were emanating from the New World. In Jamaica, however, Selassie's coronation sparked a wave of renewed black pride and confidence that the end of colonial oppression must be at hand. Selassie's former title, Ras Tafari, and name soon lent itself to the new movement, which was part of political ideology and part religion. So that's where we get the term Rastafarianism is from the he becomes the emperor of Ethiopia after Ethiopia's independence. He changes his name from Rastafari to um, Emperor Haile Selassie the First. But his original name, Rastafari, is how we get the name Rastafarianism. Again, part religion and part political ideology. Rastafarians adhere to the teachings of the Bible, which they believe to have been originally written in an Ethiopian language. They reject colonial domination and seek to recover a shared black identity. However, there is no centralized authority within the Rastafarian community, and there are no administrative hierarchies or orthodox beliefs. Rastafarians are not even agreed about the identity of Emperor Haile Selassie. Some believe that he is Christ reincarnate, while others regard him as a prophet. The fact that Selassie was assassinated in 1974 led some to lose their faith, but devout followers maintained either that his death had been faked or that he survived in a spiritual form. Despite the negligible status of Rastafarianism as a religion, there are at most 1 million practitioners around the world. It has attracted significant attention due to the popular success of reggae music. Many Jamaican musicians of the 1960s found themselves drawn to the ideology, and reggae music soon came to embody Rastafarian identity and beliefs. Rastafarians were also quick to establish a wide variety of symbols: the green, yellow, and red colors of the Ethiopian flag, dreadlocks, and cannabis use, that helped identify practitioners of the larger community. All of these symbols came to be associated with reggae as well. When reggae gained popularity abroad following the success of the 1973 film The Harder They Come, a wide variety of cultural symbols were therefore available for use in identifying and promoting the new musical style. For most people, it is the sound of reggae music that initially attracts them to the genre. All reggae songs have a moderate, laid-back tempo. They are in quadruple meter, but the emphasis is on the offbeat, which is usually marked by two sharply articulated strums on the electric guitar. The bass also plays an important role, accentuating strong beats and contributing counter melodies, while the drums hold the groove in place. Other typical instruments include the electric organ, which often fulfills a similar role to that of the guitar, and jazz-derived horns, including the saxophone and trumpet. The rhythms in reggae emerge from the interactions of these various instruments, each of which contributes one element to a complex groove. No single instrument is responsible for the rhythmic character of a song, but each has a unique role in sustaining the beat. At the same time, individual players are free to vary their rhythms, the result of which is a flexible groove that shifts in form while maintaining its essential identity. In reggae, various rhythmic patterns, termed rhythms, have specific names and coded meanings, known only to those initiated into the tradition. The essential structure of the rhythmic texture, however, is derived from African practices and can be found in various musical traditions of the African diaspora. We will hear this type of groove in a recording of Get Up, Stand Up. Before considering the sound of the song, however, we must address the lyrics. The message of Get Up, Stand Up is embodied by its short chorus, which calls on the listener to stand up for your rights, with the added encouragement, don't give up the fight. All three verses also conclude with the same stand up for your rights refrain, which echoes both the text and music of the chorus. While the chorus and concluding refrains are unambiguous, the three verses contain references to the Rastafarian belief system that might be lost to the uninitiated. The first verse opens with a derisive reference to a preacher man, who symbolizes the institutionalized and white Christian church, which Rastafarians regard as an oppressive force. It continues on to warn that not all that glitters is gold, a reflection of the Rastafarian disdain for worldly possessions. The second verse mocks those who await the second coming of Christ, while the third makes the observation that the Almighty Jah is a living man, both expressions that rest on the common Rastafarian belief that Emperor Haile Selassie is, or was, God incarnate. So here we see the man in question, Rastafari Mokenen, who later becomes Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia, many of which in the Rastafarian tradition, even though he didn't believe it, thought that he was either the second coming of Christ or that he was himself God. In sum, therefore, Get Up, Stand Up is a song steeped in the Rastafarian tradition that calls for the listener to pursue both spiritual and political freedom. The call to protest embodied in his chorus is broad and might be applied to any number of specific situations. The verses, however, outline a uniquely Rastafarian worldview that few listeners are likely to accept. In this way, Get Up Stand Up might be considered a deeply flawed protest song, for it seems to be intimately tied to the time and place of its origin, while Blowin' in the Wind could be about any war or any oppressive situation. Get Up Stand Up is explicitly about the Jamaican experience. The creators of Get Up Stand Up, however, would not have seen this specificity as a flaw. They were committed to giving voice to the oppressed among the African diaspora, and they couldn't care less about whether their song could be conveniently exploited by others. Get Up Stand Up was the creation of two of reggae's chief architects, Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. The song was initially inspired by the suffering of impoverished Haitians, whose condition Marley witnessed when touring the island in the early 1970s. Marley recorded several versions of the song with his group, the Wailers, while Tosh released his own solo version. We will consider the first recording of Get Up Stand Up, which appeared on the Wailers' 1973 album, Burnin'. The track begins with a few drum hits, after which the basic pulse is established by various electric guitars. The groove, with all of its parts in place, enters along with Marley's voice. Although most of the instruments of the band are occupied with the groove, a guitar, the sound of which is produced by a wah-wah pedal, occasionally interjects melodic riffs, while an electric bass periodically fills in between sung phrases. Marley's voice is recorded on several tracks, which allows him to converse with himself in a call-and-response style. While one Marley sings the chorus, another provides encouragement. His informal yet impassioned vocal delivery is meant to connect emotionally with the listener and spur them into action. The idea of collectivity is reinforced by double tracking on the chorus. Because we actually hear more than one voice singing the call to protest, we easily imagine a crowd, and just as easily join in ourselves. The chorus, after all, is very easy to sing. It contains only 4 pitches, and the melody outlines the stepwise ascent of a scale. So check out this video here of Get Up Stand Up by Bob Marley. It looks like maybe this video has an error, but I will upload a new version of this same song. The harmonies, likewise, are also easy to play. The entire song essentially rests on a single minor triad, a harmony that reinforces the seriousness of the song's message, and that literally anyone could provide using a guitar or piano. Here, however, we run into some difficulty. For while it is easy to replicate the harmony and melody of the chorus to Get Up Stand Up, it is very difficult to replicate the style. To do so requires a broad array of electric instruments, each played by an expert with perfect timing and deep knowledge of their role in the groove. This can only be accomplished in a staged setting. While Peter Yarrow was able to strum his guitar and lead a sing-along of Blowin' in the Wind at a 2011 Occupy Wall Street protest, for example, Get Up Stand Up is more likely to be blasted over loudspeakers as it was during the 2011 teachers' strike in Madison, Wisconsin. So here we see 2 protest videos, examples of music as protest. One is Blowin' in the Wind for Occupy Wall Street in 2011, and the other is Get Up Stand Up. The difference is this was made using a live guitar being played acoustically and leading the singers, whereas this one is a strike where they're actually playing the track on a boombox or on some speakers, because it is very hard to produce this song in the style of reggae music. You would need all the right equipment and right performers. So check out those 2 videos, please. Okay, we're going to continue with our last section of this chapter, Dmitri Shostakovich, a Russian composer, and his piece, Symphony No. 5. One of the most famous pieces of protest music in the European concert tradition might not have been a protest at all. Experts still debate the meaning of Shostakovich's Symphony No. 5. Some believe that it was a harsh rejection of the totalitarian regime under which he lived and worked, while others are skeptical of this interpretation. Because Symphony No. 5 is a piece of absolute music, which is instrumental music that does not narrate an explicit story, it can be interpreted in many different ways. While this leaves the message in question, it also has permitted the work to have a powerful impact on generations of listeners. Dmitri Shostakovich was born shortly before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, in which the long-standing Tsarist regime was overthrown and the Soviet Union was born. The revolution brought hope to many Russians. Life under the Tsars had been difficult for all but the aristocracy, with no chance for upward mobility and little freedom. The new government promised to improve the lot of Russia's working class, bringing opportunities for education and economic success. Soon, however, the Soviet Union ran into trouble. After the first decade, economic hardships led to dissatisfaction. At the same time, Joseph Stalin, who had become head of the government followed the death of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1924, set out to consolidate his power. While the Soviet Union was meant to be governed by a committee, Stalin soon had absolute control. Part of his strategy was to deflect blame for the nation's struggles onto others. In the 1930s, he held a series of public show trials in which prominent members of the government were convicted of crimes against the Soviet people. In this way, he purged the government of all those who did not support him while positioning himself as an advocate of the people. This is the environment in which Shostakovich finished his education and began his career. Shostakovich gained international fame at the age of 19, when his Symphony No. 1 was well received not only in the Soviet Union, but in Europe as well. At first, unsurprisingly, the young composer produced music in support of the government. Many of his early works explicitly praised Soviet leaders and celebrated the revolution. It seems that he personally felt optimistic about his nation's future. And of course, here we see Vladimir Lenin. The arts, however, faced difficult times under Stalin. Stalin believed in the power of artists to influence public opinion and encourage dissent. For this reason, he went to great lengths to keep creative workers under control. He did so through a combination of censorship, intimidation, and outright murder. Stalin's strategy for taking control of the music establishment was very clever indeed. He began in 1929 by reforming the nation's music conservatories, which were prestigious schools that trained performers, conductors, schools, and composers. So he's reforming the music conservatories. His first move was to fire the faculty and replace them with partisans, so people similar to his political affiliations. Next, he changed the admission standards such that only students from working-class backgrounds were permitted to attend. These reforms were to be short-lived, but he had made his point. When the professors were allowed to return to their posts, they understood that Stalin had total power over their careers and lives, and were ready to fall into line. So this breaks down one of the homework questions toward the end, talking about the different ways that Stalin was able to control the arts and why he did so. Here's some further information. In 1932, Stalin formed the Union of Soviet Composers, USC, a national organization in which all composers were required to participate. The purpose of the USC was to ensure that members only created music that upheld the values of the government and portrayed it in a positive light. Members were required to hold each other accountable and report any deviant behavior to the authorities. With all the composers living in fear and spying on one another, Stalin was in a position to dictate the messages that were being broadcast in concert halls and opera houses. All composers were required to uphold the doctrine of socialist realism. Exactly what constituted socialist realism was never made entirely clear, which is what gave the doctrine its power. Stalin always had the final say concerning any individual work, and his judgment alone could determine whether the composer had met the required standard or not. All artistic works, however, were expected to portray the communist revolution in a positive light. They were to be optimistic and uplifting, and they were certainly not permitted to criticize the Soviet Union or depress the consumer. Stalin also required that concert music be accessible to all citizens, and he preferred that it be based on popular or folk styles. If a musical work was condemned as formalist, then it had failed to achieve these goals, and the composer would face serious repercussions. Following the success of his Symphony No. 1, Shostakovich continued to climb the ranks of Soviet composers. By the 1930s, he was certainly the best known and most influential. When he finally ran afoul of the government, therefore, it was a major event. In 1934, Shostakovich premiered an opera, his second, entitled Lady Macbeth of the Mentz District. The opera was based on a 1965 novella by Nikolai Leskov that centered on Katerina, the neglected wife of a well-to-do merchant. In the novella, Katerina has an affair that ultimately leads to her and her lover committing a series of murders to protect their secret. After they are captured, convicted, and sent to a prison work camp, the man leaves Katerina for another female prisoner. Overcome with fury and grief, Katerina seizes him and leaps into an icy river where they both perish. In short, Lady Macbeth of the Mentz District featured a typical operatic narrative, full of romance and violence and ending in tragedy. The opera was a huge success in Leningrad and Moscow, performing to enthusiastic audiences for 2 years. Then, in 1936, Stalin himself attended a performance in Moscow. He had recently attended a performance of Ivan Zerhinsky's opera, Quiet Flows the Don, an overtly pro-government work with little artistic merit. Ironically, much of the opera had been orchestrated by Shostakovich, who stepped in to help his less adept colleague. Stalin publicly demonstrated his support, giving the piece a standing ovation and insisting upon meeting the composer. 9 days later, he saw Lady Macbeth. This time, Stalin did not even stay to the end. The next day, an article entitled "Muddle Instead of Music" appeared in Pravda, the official government newspaper. The article was unsigned, but readers understood that it spoke for Stalin himself. The article began by condemning Lady Macbeth in terms of subject matter and musical expression. The opera celebrated corruption, reveled in degradation, and lacked musical clarity. Next, the author began to attack past works of Shostakovich, arguing that he had been working against the doctrine of socialist realism for many years. Finally, the article included a clear warning for the composer. If Shostakovich did not mend the error in his ways, he might find himself in serious trouble. This anonymous article raised some questions. Why did Lady Macbeth come under condemnation 2 years after it had been premiered, and after it had been well received? How is it that many of Shostakovich's pieces that had been previously being accepted as good were suddenly denounced as bad? What was the purpose of this article? Although we can never know for sure, it seems likely that Shostakovich had simply become too successful, and therefore too powerful. With a single anonymous article, Stalin was able to put him in his place. The article meant an immediate halt to all aspects of Shostakovich's career. Performances of his work were cancelled and commissions were withdrawn. The composer himself called off the premiere of his Symphony No. 4, which had been about to take place. He lost all standing in the Union of Soviet Composers and was essentially blacklisted. Shostakovich also feared for his life. In fact, for a month following the publication of the article, he spent nights on his porch so that the police would not wake up his children when they came to arrest him. His fears were justified, for many other composers had already disappeared, having been taken away to prisons or work camps. However, the police did not come, and after a time, Shostakovich's thought turned to revitalization of his career. In order to be readmitted to the music establishment, he needed to be formally rehabilitated. This process required a public apology and the creation of a new work that would demonstrate his contrition. With rehabilitation in mind, he began work on his Symphony No. 5. When Symphony No. 5 premiered in Leningrad in 1937, it was accompanied by another article, this time signed by the composer, Shostakovich himself. The article was entitled "An Artist's Creative Response to Just Criticism." In it, Shostakovich, or more likely a government agent writing on his behalf, admitted that he had strayed from the path illuminated by socialist realism, but proclaimed that he had seen the error of his ways and desired to reform. He described Symphony No. 5 as an autobiographical account of his personal suffering and rebirth, culminating in a return to optimism. The symphony does indeed follow a general trajectory from darkness to light, the same trajectory as Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, which clearly served as a model. We discuss this in Chapter 7. The first movement is angsty and tormented.
Its jagged melodies and sparse instrumentation seem to portray devastation and hopelessness. The brief second movement is a bizarre waltz. The third and fourth movements, however, bring the listener through catharsis to a possible triumph, and it is these that we will examine closely. According to reports, the audience wept throughout the third movement of Symphony No. 5. The music is certainly sorrowful. A dirge-like tempo combines with winding melodies in the minor mode to express an unmistakable despair. Sometimes the instruments imitate speech, as if they are attempting to put into words an emotion that cannot be spoken. Shostakovich's orchestration is sparse. He includes only strings, harp, and a few solo winds, each of which take their turn with the melody. However, there is another explanation for the listener's reaction. In this music, Shostakovich captures the sound of Russian Orthodox funeral music. This would have resonated with his audience on several levels. To begin with, times were very difficult in the late 1930s, as the Soviet population was devastated by famine and disease. Everyone in the hall knew someone who had died, and everyone was mourning. At the same time, the government had abolished the Russian Orthodox religion and closed the churches. Nobody had heard this music for decades. As such, it also represented the past and all that had been lost. Despite its portrayal of agony, however, the third movement concludes on a note of hope. The final minutes are calm, and the closing chords are in the major mode. So here's a video example that you can check out. Please pause and listen to this. This is a representation of typical Russian Orthodox funeral music. By listening to this, you'll have a better chance of listening for it in the full movement 3 of Shostakovich's Symphony No. 5. And here's the full third movement. So I hope that you will pause and check out this entire third movement, the Largo section from this symphony by Shostakovich, a very beautiful and very mournful piece. Like we read in the previous slide, it contains music that is very reminiscent of Orthodox Russian church music, which had been banned for decades by the government. So you can imagine the cathartic effect that this would have had on the audience hearing this deeply spiritual music that had been outlawed for decades, especially at a time when many people had died from famine and disease sparked by the government and its policies at this time. So this kind of demonstrates how music can be very powerful in referencing the shared experience of the listeners. The fourth movement begins with a terrifying crash, as pounding drums introduce a militaristic minor mode theme in the brass instruments. The music grows in excitement for several minutes before giving way to a period of calm. In this middle section, Shostakovich introduces a quote from a song he had composed years before using a text by the poet Alexander Pushkin. The title of the song is, in fact, Rebirth, and it describes the process of peeling away an outer layer accumulated over time to reveal the true substance beneath. After this interlude, the music regains momentum, building to a dramatic major mode conclusion. It is here, however, that we must pause to debate what this music really means. The closing passage of Symphony No. 5 features the ringing high notes of trumpets backed up by the entire orchestra. Played at a fast tempo, as it often is, the music is thrilling and triumphant. However, this approach to performing the coda, which means the tail or the ending, seems to have derived from a misprint in the first published version of the symphony, which indicated a lively tempo of 188 quarter notes per minute. In reality, Shostakovich wanted this passage to be performed at a tempo of 184 eighth notes per minute, which at less than half of the misprinted tempo is actually quite slow. At this speed, the music sounds not triumphant, but painful. The trumpet players agonize as they blast out their high notes, while the string players saw back and forth for minutes on end. One can literally hear the suffering of the musicians. When the symphony finally ends, it is with a sensation of exhaustion not overcoming, as if the orchestra has been beaten into submission. Some commentators have described the passage as a false smile, put on because the authorities have required as much, but not a true representation of joy. So here we can see the discrepancy in action. We'll get to hear it on the next slides too. But the way that this was performed at the premiere and oftentimes is still performed, was 188 BPM for the quarter note, which is quite fast tempo wise. The misprinted type, they're saying is a misprint. The true tempo that people maintain that Shostakovich was intending was actually about half as fast, a little bit less than half as fast actually. So it would have felt much more slow, a lot less energetic. But remember, we're still playing all the same musical material. So when they talk about how it first seems thrilling and triumphant, that's the fast tempo version. The way that it was probably intended to be played would actually cause the players to be exhausted by the end because you're playing all of these notes at such a slow speed. It would make the whole piece twice as long too when you think about it. So just to put this in perspective, here is a tempo of 188 beats per minute for the quarter note, like they mentioned for the misprint speed is right here. So you can think 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But actually, what we're saying is that it was probably meant to be performed at this speed, but half as fast, so like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm actually counting half as quickly there, and you can see how that would have such a big effect on the tempo. The controversy over the tempo is only part of the story. For many decades, fans of Shostakovich have wanted to hear Symphony No. 5 as protest music and to believe that the composer was defying the government. They received confirmation in 1979 when Soviet musicologist Solomon Volkov published a book entitled Testimony. Volkov claimed that he had sat with Shostakovich during his final weeks and wrote down the composer's reminiscences. In Testimony, Volkov confirmed that Shostakovich had always stood in opposition to the Soviet regime and that Symphony No. 5 was indeed meant to protest its oppressive rule. However, Volkov was almost immediately discredited by Shostakovich's wife, who said that he and her husband were hardly ever even acquainted. Few continued to take his account seriously. The response following the concert was also mixed. Some critics did not feel that Shostakovich had successfully communicated the personal metamorphosis outlined in his article. The third movement, they felt, was simply too sad, while the fourth movement failed to offer the transformative rebirth that was promised. However, the audience was thrilled and gave the symphony a 30-minute standing ovation. Perhaps for this reason, the government officially accepted Shostakovich's apology and declared him rehabilitated. He was able to return to his work, although with the knowledge that Solomon could end his career and his life if he failed to keep in line. The controversy surrounding Symphony No. 5 is possible because of its status as absolute music. On the one hand, it is just a symphony, just music, just sound. It is titled with a number, and the movements are marked only with their tempos. It is therefore impossible to prove that the music is about one thing or another. The symphony's various contexts, however, which include its role as Shostakovich's rehabilitation piece, the accompanying article, the musical references, and its expressive language, give us a great deal of material to use in debate. The symphony must be about something. To this day, however, no one has conclusively proven that what Shostakovich meant to communicate with his Symphony No. 5. And here we can see really well done timestamps here from the text, but with the two recordings. So this first one here is the Bernstein version. We can see here in this rendition, the times are going to move more quickly. So this is more at the mismarked maybe tempo marking, whereas this version, the tempo is actually slower. So we get to see the two contrasting possible versions of this piece. And here we're really talking about the coda section right here. This is where the tempo marking debate comes into question, is right around this mark here. And that's the end of the chapter. So I love including some work by Shostakovich. He's one of my favorite composers. And just knowing that he was kind of at odds with the government, who had control over his work is a really interesting idea, something that a lot of us never have to face. But knowing that his work was under such harsh scrutiny, and knowing that he had control over his work, but at the same time, we don't know how it was really intended. But we know from his life that he did have a lot of personal suffering due to the government, and it just is really interesting to see how can music really be a protest in this specific way. So you have a little bit of homework to do. Please make sure that you watch all the slides and all the videos within them, and I hope that you have a good rest of your week. Thanks so much.